50 years ago, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird gently showed us the wounds of our region's oppressive social system. And more recently, the best-selling novel, The Help, has shown us more of the painfulness and the oppressiveness of the way we did things back then. And now, a new novel by a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill gives us an even clearer and more disturbing view. Imagine that Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird was the daughter of a member of the Ku Klux Klan rather than the daughter of a beloved country lawyer. And if you do that, you'll get a preview of The Queen of Palmyra, the new novel by Minrose Gwin, who will be our guest on North Carolina Bookwatch next.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.
Welcome to North Carolina Bookwatch. I'm D.G. Martin, and my guest is Minrose Gwin. She's the author of The Queen of Palmyra. Have I said that right?
Yes.
That's great. I'm so glad that you joined us.
Thank you for having me.
I think this is such a wonderful book. About you, you've been a writer most of your working life. You've been a newspaper journalist. Yeah. Best known, I guess, before this novel as a writer of a wonderful memoir. How am I going to say this? You won't confess to being a poet, but you write poetry. You've published poetry. And you have taught writing and literature in lots of different venues. Currently, you're a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Yes,
and
yes.
We're thrilled that you've agreed to talk about your book. So I also want you to ask us, this is your first novel.
Yes, it is. It's my first novel, and it took me 7 summers to write it. And it was a very, very monumental challenge for me.
Well, this book, I like to ask authors, is your book character-driven or is your book plot-driven? And your book has compelling characters, and it's got a plot that creeps up on you. It's got a plot that's compelling. But let's talk about characters first.
Sure.
Tell us about your main character. This is the young woman who, in the introduction, I said was the daughter of a member of the Ku Klux Klan, growing up in a small southern Mississippi town.
Yes, her name is Florence Forrest, and she's 10 going on 11. And she, actually, the novel is narrated by the older Florence, who's...
It's not confusing, but because it's narrated by the same person, but from a perspective of looking back. It's
yes.
like a memoir in some respects.
Yes, and the voice of Florence fluctuates between the past and the present. So sometimes she sounds very childlike, and sometimes she pulls back and comments and thinks about what it is that's happened.
Someday I want to talk to you about the use of the different voices, but now I just want you to tell us about Florence.
Okay, Florence is she's a girl who's trying to figure out what's going on. Her mother is the cake lady for a small town called
Cake lady?
Yeah, she bakes the cakes
She's
for
the person
town.
in town you can go to when a wedding or a
or just Sunday
or
dinner or whatever.
She'll get you that great multi-layered, delicious cake that you couldn't make yourself.
Yes, and since the father is not known to be able to make very much money because he can't work with anybody, she brings in most of the income of the family by baking these cakes. And she is a very progressive person for the period. Her mother, her mother is, Martha.
This is the 1963 or so.
Yeah, it's set in the summer of 1963, and I'd love to say more about that summer, but I'll go back to Gwin for us, Florence's father, who he's a very brutal man. There are reasons for that in his childhood, but he is, and even as he is a leader of the local chapter of the KKK, the Nighthawk of the KKK, which means he wears black.
He's got special responsibilities.
And he guards the Clavering and so forth. The mother is always trying to warn the African American community of coming actions. So, and she makes runs to the bootlegger at night, the black bootlegger at night, to try to pass messages to them, and takes Florence with her on these bootleg runs. And so there's this huge tension and friction within Florence's household.
So Florence is trying to love both her father and her mother, and they're sort of going in different directions, at least in terms of the response to the racial situation in Mississippi in 1963.
Yes, and her mother's moving deeper and deeper into alcoholism as the novel progresses. So Florence attaches herself to her grandmother's housekeeper and follows her home. The grandmother's housekeeper's named Zenie Johnson, named after the legendary Queen of Palmyra. And she, in this sense, Florence crosses that kind of invisible boundary between the white part of town and the African American part of town, which in the novel is called Shake Rag. I didn't make that up. I actually grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, and Shake Rag is
the real African American part of town.
Exactly.
Well, folks in North Carolina would, particularly small town North Carolina, would not be unfamiliar with the way we divided up our residential living areas back then.
And actually this town, Millwood, is divided in three distinct areas. One, the middle class or upper middle class white area, one Shake Rag, and the other is called Milltown, which is the place where the poor white mill workers work in the cotton mill this year.
So Florence is really living in three different worlds. One is her father's world of the Ku Klux Klan, her mother's world of sort of a progressive white, wondering what to do in a situation in which there's real violence being inflicted on the African American community by the Klan, and then as a pretty comfortable, maybe more comfortable, she finds herself more comfortable in the with African American people and in the African American part of town. So she's got these three worlds that she's trying to live in at the same time. Yes,
and when Zenie's niece, Eva Green, comes to town, Eva is a student at Tougaloo University, the traditionally black institution in Jackson, and begins to cause a great deal of trouble in the town. Florence becomes even more embedded in the black household.
So I was going to ask you about Eva, but it's Eva. Eva
as an elephant.
Yeah, okay.
As Eva said.
But and this turns out to be one of the, or Eva turns out to be one of the critical, most important characters, at least for me in your book.
Yes.
And it's just hard to get back into those times, but as you took us there, I got incredibly interested. So Eva comes back. This town is totally segregated, and it's more than segregation. This is a caste system in which African Americans are locked into a system in which economically they're just the victims of a white-dominated economic system. And here comes this young black college student
from North Carolina.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, from North Carolina. Good. But,
working for North Carolina Mutual. So.
Yeah, she starts out working for the burial insurance.
Yeah.
The black competitor to a economic system that had been dominated by whites. In other words, whites were not afraid to come into the black section and sell burial insurance at 50 cents a week or $1 a week or something like that to pay for your burial. And then here comes this North Carolina young woman, North Carolina, what they would call colored girl, and starts competing with
yes,
them.
and Win Forrest's occupation is the policy man for Shake Rag. So the conflict immediately emerges, you know, in terms of, and he is struggling to maintain a living. And so Florence's parents are not well off at all. Her grandparents are, but her parents are not. And so there's a real economic, the book is partly about class as well as race.
Well, I want to take us through a couple of scenes. I don't want to, I hope this doesn't compromise the book at all, but there are some really wonderful scenes in your book. And what you mentioned that Win Forrest, Florence's dad, is an important member of the Ku Klux Klan, and he has this box of his Klan goods that he allows Florence to go, and eventually he shows her what's in there. And then, well, you tell us, he takes her to a Klan meeting.
Yes, he does, and that was a very difficult scene for me to write, because the Klan, I've read a lot about the Klan, and I've also read a lot about group abuse of children in all sorts of different ways, and it's very subtle in there, but I guess you notice that she gets passed around from person to person in the Klan meeting, and after a while her memory just goes. She just fades out. And there's a sense in which we wonder what took place there. They make her own little outfit. This is what,
she's wearing a Klan
yes,
outfit on one day, and then the next day she's going into the black African American section,
yes,
to be with her friends.
Yes, and this is kind of toward about 2/3 the way through the book. She's starting to get really so traumatized that it's very hard for her to even talk to anybody and so forth. What hopefully, I mean, what helps her a great deal is that Eva Green has agreed to tutor her. Eva is a student. She's in her senior year. She's going to be a teacher of the 5th grade, which is where Florence needs to be the following year. And
Florence is having a tough time.
Yeah.
And in fact is viewed by some of the people closest to her as being slow, is that she's not able to handle the academics.
But she was out of school for a year while the father dragged them all over the South trying to find out. Yeah, I don't want to tell too much. Yeah.
Advocate, but
yeah,
but the startling thing, and I think this, if you pulled this out of the air, you'd have to say this would be stretching it. But the way that you bring us to this extraordinary result in 1963, in which, in a segregated Mississippi town, where the only person not only can be this little girl's friend, but the one who can be her academic mentor,
yes,
is an African American college student who really teaches her not just the 5th grade, but how to be a teacher.
Exactly, and Florence ends up being a teacher. Her path is not an easy one. She is haunted by the past, and I probably shouldn't say anything more about that.
No, I think you can talk a little bit about without getting to the very end. We don't want to get to the very end of it, but some of the details of how Florence comes to a crisis that just has to happen with the implosion of all these things that are operating on her. And it might help us if you'll tell us a little bit more about her grandparents and
yes,
that influence on her life.
Yes, and she was fortunate to have grandparents who were decent people, and what for those times I would say moderate people, but also very blind people in certain ways about race. The grandmother Mimi is someone who loves her hats and buys millions of hats and thinks she's doing Zini, her maid, a favor by giving her all of her old hats. And of course, Zini says she wouldn't be caught dead in those hats.
Zini had her own way of dealing with the generosity, the supposed generosity of her white friends.
The grandfather is more acutely aware of issues of poverty and so forth among the African Americans in the town, and he lends business men money to open stores, and he tries to work with them. But also he has his own weaknesses as well. He is also limited by the times.
Well, this was, I don't want to argue with you about this, but
oh, go ahead.
in my reading of the book, this your description of the Florence's grandparents, very kind, ordinary people, but set in the time of 1963 in Mississippi, and that was where they lived, and they weren't going to live any other place. But and I thought you were kind to them, as we are to our grandparents and great-grandparents, our parents, and ourselves, as we lived in those times, and looking back, didn't do enough to confront the kind of social system that today looks just horrible, but then looked quite ordinary and quite the way that we did things.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, and saying that he was too moderate. He didn't go far enough. And I said to someone yesterday when I was doing a radio show that Atticus Finch was about, that kind of moderation, but good-mindedness was about as good as it got in a small town. Well, the book was set in 1930s, but even in the 1960s.
If you were much further along than Atticus Finch in that time, or of Florence's grandparents, you needed to move out of town because you weren't going to be comfortable living with your colleagues in those towns. Except for some of the heroes, and you develop your heroes. You make Eva a big hero.
Yeah, and she is a hero. The title of the novel, The Queen of Palmyra, comes from the legendary queen of 3rd century A.D., Zenobia, and she was quite a woman. And Zini's named after her, but she was a warrior queen. She led tens of thousands of troops into battle all the time, bearing one breast in order for them to know who she was so they could follow her. She took on Rome. She lost, but when they paraded her through the streets in chains, she demanded gold chains. And so the question in the novel for me is there's several characters in the novel that kind of rise to the occasion, who may not be particularly heroic characters, but rise to the occasion in the book. And so I see the Queen of Palmyra title as kind of rotating throughout the book.
From hero to hero, or from character to character.
Yes, and Eva, I think, is certainly a queenly presence.
Now let's talk a little bit about where this came from. And you've written your memoir.
Yeah.
But there obviously, your experience growing up has got to have influenced, and some of the people that you knew who were in the African American community must be models for this. Tell us a little bit about the intersection of this novel with the reality of your life.
Well, I did have, my grandmother did have a housekeeper, and I used to visit her in her house. And when I was little, she used to babysit me in her house. But and when I got older, I would visit her in her house, and I would go when I was in college. I would go visit her there as well. So She was a real model for me. She was a real mentor for me because she was very, very smart and very hardworking, and she was encouraging to me, and I really appreciated that.
So she had Eva qualities in terms of inspiring and teaching and beyond what you might expect from a servant.
Yeah, her name actually was Eva Lee Miller, and she was really a brilliant woman.
Well, also in your memoir you describe your relationship with your mom, who is also apparently a wonderful person, but had some of the similar characteristics of the mother in this story.
Yes, my mother was a really brilliant woman and a wonderful poet. And in my memoir, I have a lot of her poetry, and I've published, edited and published a collection of her poetry. But she succumbed to mental illness, and particularly in the latter part of her life, her life was short. She died at 67. And the memoir is really about my struggle to try to take care of her during those years of her mental illness, which is very, very difficult. This was back in the 80s, and antidepressants had just come onto the market, and it was heart-wrenching. And I did a terrible job of it. I was quite young myself, but there was really nobody else to do it.
Well, I thought of this. Maybe I got off on the wrong direction, but when at one point when Florence's mother left, had to go away, and left the cake business sort of right there in the middle of it, and Florence decided she was going to keep the cake business going. Well, this is an impossible task to take for a child, to take these complicated cake recipes. And Florence does this, starts a fire, it becomes a great catastrophe, but it's all because she's just determined to take care of her mom. And I said, well, this has got to come out of some part of your life.
Yeah, she's determined to take care of her mom, and she understands, Florence understands that the family's economic necessity. So she's trying to make that money and keep the cake business running. And I actually think Florence could have made those cakes if she hadn't set the kitchen on fire.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's great. Well, we've only touched just around this book. One of the things that I loved about your book, if I can find this, is some of what you describe as are some of your descriptions about making stories.
Oh yeah.
And here's one thing that just grabbed my attention. I want you to talk about writing stories and writing this story. You said some stories are uneasy sleepers. They roam a dark house, gliding like silk from room to room, touching a sleeping form here, reaching in a cover there. Maybe they will wake up on their feet and be confused as to their whereabouts, or maybe they will unlock the front door without a sound and walk down the street and out into the night, never to be heard from again. Now, you're writing fiction and a story that's compelling and grabbing, but those words, they didn't just flow off your, I mean, that's poetry. And it says something about your belief about a story. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to catch you by surprise, but what is the story?
Well, I think the power of the story is such an important part of this book, and that's one passage. There are quite a few passages like that kind of contemplate the importance of stories. I think that Florence has 3 different stories that are told to her, or she reads, or are read to her. One is the story of Uncle Wiggily, and
it's her grandfather's story.
Yeah, that's the grandfather's story. Zini tells her the stories of the great legendary queen Zenobia, and her father tells her stories that are very racist in nature, Bamba and the Dismal Swamp, and about a white boy that gets dropped into a jungle. And so there's a lot of stories that are percolating in her mind. Yeah, and she has to choose what story. She has to choose her stories,
Well, the
And-
big story
Yeah.
is the story that she, at her different ages, tells with your help in this wonderful book, The Queen of Palmyra. It's a wonderful story, a wonderful set of stories, however you want to describe it. And we thank you so much for sharing it with us and then talking with us about it today.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it very much, DG.
Thank you. Thanks to Minrose Gwin, the author of The Queen of Palmyra. Thanks to all y'all for listening. We'll be right back here same time next week to introduce you to another great North Carolina writer. In the meantime, I hope you'll check our webpage, our blog, and you can get information about Minrose Gwin and about some of the other authors that we featured on North Carolina Bookwatch. Until next time.
Funding for North Carolina Bookwatch is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV, and by the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, Quail Ridge Books and Music, and the North Carolina Humanities Council.